Okay, so welcome everyone. We have an audience and we have a very interesting lineup of presenters today on this panel on foreign policy and more particularly EU and the world. And I'm happy to chair this panel from Canterbury, UK. My name is Baris and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Kent, and my research is on the crisis management operations of international organizations. And like I said, today we have a very interesting lineup of presentations. I'm very much looking forward to hear about the insights. So let me introduce you in the order of our panelists. So we'll kick off today with a presentation from Magdalena König, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Groningen. And then that will be followed by the presentation from Taro Nishikawa, who's a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Social Sciences at University of Leuven. And then we'll continue with Lewin Schmitt's presentation, who is a fellow at Institute Barcelona de Estudis Internacionals, and he's also a PhD candidate at Universitat Pompeu Fabra. And we will then continue with a co-authored presentation by Bruno Luciano, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Sao Paulo State University in Brazil. And then this paper is also authored by Dr. Cairo Junqueira, who is an assistant professor at the Federal University of Sergipe. So without further ado, I think Magdalena can kick us off with her presentation on the spatio-temporal politics of EU counterterrorism practices. I think this is going to be an interesting contribution and actually a quite timely contribution to our knowledge about how the EU kind of frames its counterterrorism policies. And I'm really looking forward to it. And the stage is yours, Magdalena. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just sharing my screen.
Okay, perfect.
I hope you can see it.
Yeah, sounds good.
Perfect.
And looks good.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm happy to be here with you and to discuss your work, and also I'm curious to hear your comments and feedback on my work. So as already announced, I'm presenting a paper on the spatio-temporal politics of EU counterterrorism practices in Southeast Europe. This is the first draft of as a part of my PhD project that I'm conducting at the University of Groningen. Just a quick note: when I speak of Southeast Europe, I speak of a broad region that the EU names Western Balkans in response to some academic discussions and civil society discussions. I use the term Southeast Europe, but I mean refer to in this paper at least to the candidate states and the potential candidate states in Southeast Europe. So why am I interested in this? So I'll first talk about my research puzzle before going into my actual research. So I have observed that there is an increasing focus on counterterrorism in EU enlargement towards Southeast Europe. So never before has counterterrorism as a policy area been as prominent as now. And in this counterterrorism, the policy area of counterterrorism, there is an increasing focus on preventing and countering violent extremism, which is a specific form of counterterrorism, in contrast to police-based counterterrorism, which engages or which uses investigation or prosecution. This PCVE aims at changing the conditions of the environments conducive to radicalization. So it builds on a huge variety of societal actors in education, health, citizen-state relations, judiciary, etc. And therefore, it opens up a space of action for counterterrorism policy that is relatively new to counterterrorism policy. So many sectors are involved in preventing terrorism. And this preventive approach to counterterrorism relies on risk management, on risk imagination, and therefore also relies on temporal imaginary. So what will the future bring? How does the future look like? How do we need to change the present? And what does the past tell us about the future, and also about spatial imaginaries as counterterrorism policy does. So who belongs and who doesn't. If you place this, or if you look at this in the context of the enlargement framework, this brings its own spatial and temporal imaginaries of Southeast Europe and Southeast European EU relations with it, as enlargement is such a spatialized process. So that's why I'm interested in this topic. And I ask, how do spatio-temporal imaginaries inform the EU's counterterrorism and PCVE practices in Southeast Europe? My tentative argument, this might change with further research, but my tentative argument here is that the EU's approach to PCVE practices in Southeast Europe justifies a need to prevent a risky future for the enlarged EU. And this is, in this argument, particularly needed in Southeast Europe because of the particular spatio-temporalities of Southeast Europe. I'll give you a short background on counterterrorism and EU enlargement, more historically and in Southeast Europe. So from a historical perspective, actually counterterrorism is not a new policy area. But as I've already mentioned, it has never been as prominent as now. So for example, in the negotiations with Turkey, this has played a role. The EU's role in this is that as in most areas in enlargement, the EU funds policies and programs, it coordinates, it sets the priorities, but it does not, at least most often, implement itself, but it relies on implementing partners such as UN organizations, embassies, or national and local organizations. In this EU counterterrorism approach in Southeast Europe, I see three main principles that are at play here. We see that the EU prefers regional cooperation over a bilateral approach. So when possible, all 6 candidates are taken together. The EU externalizes a lot of its internal EU policies, for example, expert networks on counterterrorism that are extended or reproduced in Southeast Europe. And also we see, as I already mentioned, a prioritization of PCE, so preventing and countering violent extremism, over police-based work, increasingly, not replacing it, but complementing it. So how come that preventive counterterrorism is increasingly prioritized? So in general, we see globally and in the West and also in the EU that there is a change of counterterrorism practices from reactive right after 9/11 to preemptive in the years afterwards, to preventive, which is the approach that is increasingly favored. The literature distinguishes here between a hard approach to counterterrorism, so hard meaning police-based, relying on law enforcement and intelligence, and a soft approach, which is this PCVE approach that I've been talking about, that tries to prevent radicalization that could lead to violence and terrorism, meaning it tries to prevent it before it actually starts to develop. And the aim is to develop resilience within individuals and societies, making them resist the conditions that might be conducive to radicalization. So as you can imagine, with this broad term, it is also a broad field with various definitions. So for example, PVE, which is only a part of it, so preventing violent extremism, could be defined as a holistic approach to ensure a level of stability and cohesion in society so that violent extremism does not occur. So in that sense, this happens in the pre-crime space, meaning that no crime usually has been committed. A crime shall be prevented. And this means that the police does not have the competences to intervene, actually, if no crime is actually here. Meaning that to prevent in the PCVE way of countering terrorism, this usually relies on a whole of society approach, meaning that the whole of society shall contribute to preventing terrorism. So this involves education, health, socioeconomic support, so all kinds of contact persons, so-called first-line practitioners that can intervene. And since this takes place in the pre-crime space, this relies on imagining risks. So it's not that this is a reaction to concrete threats, but it is a future risk that is imagined in the present and on which basis policies are designed. Which brings in temporality and spatiality, because the literature argues that preventive counterterrorism highlights temporality because it is about anticipating the future. Some authors even argue that uncertain and unknowable futures are inherent to such preventive counterterrorism. And therefore, there is the argument in the literature that we are currently perceiving a temporal turn in counterterrorism away from a spatialized security conception of, for example, the Cold War security times where security was conceptualized in geopolitical terms. And I would say that spatiality actually remains important next to temporality, because on the one hand, counterterrorism itself has always and is still relying on reproducing and redefining spatialities. So, for example, if you look at camera surveillance in a specific neighborhood, this changes the experience of that space. And especially in my case, if you look at PCVE practices in the context of EU enlargement, this is particularly relevant because EU enlargement is such a spatialized process. So I say that both temporality and spatiality have been and are important dimensions of counterterrorism. I've been talking a lot about concepts that I should clarify before I move on with using them in my analysis. So with temporality, I refer to dimensions of time. So a vehicle that transports ideas of time, for example, ideas about the future, present, past, or ideas about a speed or progress development. Accordingly, spatiality I define as a vehicle that transports ideas of political space. And it's important that I perceive those two concepts as entangled. So the one transports ideas about the other and vice versa. So you cannot really separate them. And an imaginary, actually, it's more important to say what I don't want to say with an imaginary. I don't want to say that imaginaries transport ideas that are not true, but they are necessarily, imaginaries are part of the reality. So they make sense of core ideas around which political community is articulated. For example, national identity would be an imaginary. And studying imaginaries gives insights into understandings of reality that political decisions are based on. And that's why I think this is important. I rely in my analysis on 3 data generation methods. So I did a document analysis. I conducted interviews with representatives from EU institutions in Brussels and in Southeast Europe. And I did some digital ethnography observation moments. So I divide my analysis into a temporal-minded design into first, I talk about imaginaries of the future, then the present, and then the past to provide for a structure that can be followed. So when I look at how EU counterterrorism policies, and especially PCVE, imagines the future of Southeast Europe, I looked at how what security risks are identified. So where would a potential risk lie? And here I see that this is very much spatialized. So it is, when talking about the internal external security nexus, the material problematizes the spatial proximity of Southeast Europe and the EU. So it is the proximity that is a problem. Interestingly, in the framework of enlargement, whose aim is it to bring these spaces closer together. The problem of terrorism or violent extremism is imagined as flowing unidirectionally. So it is always talked about as being an import from Southeast Europe towards the EU and not the other way around. Southeast Europe is then also imagined as a space of a transit of risks. For example, through the so-called Balkan route, it's often referred to that the weapons that were used in the Bataclan terrorist attack traveled or were transported through the Balkan route into the EU. And the same similarly is imagined for returning foreign terrorist fighters that are believed to be traveling through Southeast Europe into the EU. So the spatial imaginaries of the region are an important foundation for the imaginaries of future risks in terms of terrorism and violent extremism. How is this then implemented in the present? So how should the present be changed in order to prevent these risks from developing? So here we can look at the whole of society approach that PCVE uses and the root causes that it identifies. And here we see that it is really a broad field of actions and programs. We see programs targeting good governance, state-citizen relations, social cohesion, and all in the name of countering terrorism. And interestingly, there is an overlap with the real problems that that the EU representatives and the material identifies, which is the structural obstacles to EU enlargement being corruption, social cohesion, organized crime, and rule of law. And there is a connection established between these deficits or these obstacles and radicalization. So interestingly, then the PCVE agenda tackles some of the perceived structural obstacles of EU enlargements, but with a counterterrorism agenda. And interestingly, finally, this whole approach is rooted in a certain imaginary of the past of Southeast Europe, which is imagined as violent, conflictual, and unstable, with a reference to the 1990s wars of the dissolution of Yugoslavia. And this particular imaginary of Southeast Europe's past has implications for the EU's approach. So it firstly underlines a need for prevention, because there is a continuity, at least a suggested continuity of this violent past and a potentially violent future. For example, in terms of weapons, that there is an abundance of weapons still today from the past of from the 1990s, from the wars. And there is also a continuity that suggested between the foreign fighters that joined the Bosniak army in the 1990s and the foreign fighters that have left the region to Syria and Iraq in the 2010s. This has also implications for the concrete approach of the EU. So regional cooperation is one of the guiding principles of the EU's approach to promote good neighborly relations in sense of overcoming conflict through counterterrorism policy. So to conclude, what do my results, what is my argument, what do my results mean? So I find that the EU counterterrorism politics in Southeast Europe are indeed informed by spatial and temporal imaginaries that I find are specific, very specific to the region, as at least how the EU sees the region. And to repeat my argument, so the EU's approach is informed by and reproduces a justification of PCVE practices in Southeast Europe, on the one hand, to prevent a risky future for the enlarged EU, so to eliminate risks identified. And this is particularly needed from the EU's perspective, at least in Southeast Europe, because of its particular spatial temporalities. So that's my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other presentations and to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Magdalena, and thank you particularly for sticking to the time. Just to reiterate, for each presentation we have 15 minutes, and in the end, before we finish, we'll have about half an hour of time for questions from the audience. So I'll be moving forward with the with the next presentation, and then we will collect questions when all of the presentations finish. So I think today, like I said, very interesting lineup of presenters, and we have a multidisciplinary and also multi-perspective lineup as well. So next we have Taro's presentation on the EU's trade relations with Japan, and he's going to be looking at I think a more historical perspective, but I think we can draw a lot of important lessons for the current state of affairs on the EU's international trade negotiations. So Taro is from the University of Lewin. He's a PhD candidate, and the floor is yours, Taro.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will share my screen.
Yeah, and I'll also remind you when you have a minute left. So
Yes.
just to keep things on track.
Okay, can you see my slide?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, okay. So I will start my presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Taro Nishikawa, a PhD candidate at Leuven in Faculty of Social Science, Leuven in Belgium. And my PhD project is which started in 2019, which analyzed EU-Japan trade conflicts in the 1980s and the early 1990s from the perspective of international political economy. And today, I will make a presentation about the part of this part of my PhD project. Firstly, I'd like to show my gratitude to the UACES to give me this opportunity, and also chair and the fellow panelists. And today, I will make a presentation whose title is Vertical Interplay between the European Commission and the Member States in EU Trade Policy. Firstly, my main academic question in this presentation is who influence over the European Community, EC, the current EU positions in international trade negotiations. After the EC launched the Common Commercial Policy in 1970, this question became an important scholarly research topic. Broadly speaking, there are two camps of academic current of thoughts. On one hand, some scholars point out member states' dominance. For example, greater control by member states vis-à-vis the European Commission, and also limited autonomy of the European Commission are stressed. More concretely, ex-ante control, such as trade and such as negotiation mandates, and ex-post control, such as Article 113, later 133 Committee, and the current Trade Policy Committee. On the other hand, others emphasize the relative autonomy of the European Commission. Multiple sources of autonomy of European Commission are pointed out. For example, agenda setting, agency slack, and normative repackaging, and rhetoric and cognitive framing. However, the reality might be more complicated. As Dur and Zimmermans and Elzik point out, the influence of European Commission and the member states can depend on the stage of trade negotiations. Here, I propose a hypothetical model of vertical interplay between the European Commission and the member states. So firstly, when issuing mandate, the EC position would be directed by member states' preferences, especially of those with a majority in the Council. This would be in line with the argument of a liberal intergovernmental approach by Andrew Moravchik. However, when negotiating with trading partners, the European Commission could have the reframing ability to decide how to achieve the objective of the Council's mandate within a win set of the EU. The term of a win set was introduced in two-level games model by Robert Putnam. This article applied this hypothetical model to EC Japan trade negotiations in the 1980s, specifically the EC's request for a Japanese import target in 1985. Before starting the case study, I will show you the importance of this case in the context of international trade negotiation in the 1980s. In the 1970s, the EC was hugely concerned about trade imbalances due to the torrential export of certain manufactured goods from Japan. In order to ease these conflicts, not the European Commission, the EC member states made bilateral agreements with Japan to put voluntary export restraints VERs in place. However, in the 1980s, the EC faced new challenges and changes. Firstly, the role of the European Commission in EC-Japan trade negotiations grew. Specifically, the European Commission first negotiated with the Japanese government and agreed the first EC-level voluntary export moderation on 10 goods in 1983. Secondly, even though there had been concerns for the EC and the US since the 1970s, market opening and domestic structural impediments become key discussion points in international trade negotiations, especially between Japan and the US and the EC. In this context, this article focuses on the trajectory of trade negotiations concerning the EC's request for Japanese import target in November 1985. The idea of an import target was first introduced confidentially in the Japan-US Semiconductor Agreement in 1986. However, importantly, the request by the EC was the first official request for an import target from foreign country to Japan. Also, it did not focus on specific products, and it was never accepted by the Japanese government. So now I start the case study. First, looking at the time before the Council issued its mandate. Since 1982, in the face of continuing concern from US and the EC, the Japanese government introduced several market opening measures, including tariff reduction, easing restrictions on imports, and improving the standards and conformity assessment system. Specifically, in April 1985, in line with a recommendation from the Advisory Committee for External Economic Issues, the Japanese government decided to make out comprehensive market opening measures in 6 areas, which is the Action Program for Improved Market Access. In June 1985, in response to this move, by its statement, the Foreign Affairs Council stressed the necessity of clearly verifiable commitment to a significant sustained increase in Japanese imports of manufactured and processed agriculture products in the forthcoming action program. Moreover, during the EC Japan Summit in July 1985, Commissioner Willy Duclerc, in charge of external relations, requested the increase of Japanese import rates on manufactured goods and processed agriculture products according to a numerically verifiable method. During a press conference after the summit, Jacques Delors, President of the European Commission, also mentioned the necessity of a clear target, necessity of a concrete import target. It shows that both the Council and the European Commission already required Japan to commit or target its imports. Then the Japanese government announced the outline of the action program. In July 1985, the Japanese government had put the program into practice step by step. So in short, although the EC requested Japan for clear results of an increase of Japanese import, Japan argued gradual progress of market opening. Next, let's look at the time when the Council issued its mandate to the European Commission. The European Commission communication to the Council in October 1985 emphasized that Japan should set concrete and measurable targets for a significant increase in its imports of manufactured goods. Based on this communication, the Article 113 Committee and the Foreign Affairs Council discussed the EC's relation with Japan. Concerning a request for a Japanese import target, the UK, France, and Italy were especially proactive, and only Denmark, the Netherlands, and West Germany were opposed to the idea. West Germany later accepted the idea reluctantly. So as a result, the majority of EC member states supported the idea of requesting an import target. And by its conclusion, the Council instructed the European Commission to request Japan for a quantified target with a timetable for significant increase in Japanese import of manufactured goods and processed agricultural products as a complement of its action program. Lastly, let's look at the time when European Commission negotiated with Japanese government based on the Council's mandate. The European Commission first unofficially requested the Japanese government for an import target by communicating the Council's confidential conclusion. Interestingly, after the Japanese government declined this request, the European Commission reframed the Council's mandate. Also, the conclusion mentioned a quantified target with a timetable. During a meeting with Japanese Foreign Minister Abe prior to the EC Japan ministerial meetings, Commissioner Duclerc proposed a complementary proposal, which is the introduction of a forecast of the estimated effect on imports of action program and a long-term import vision. However, in November 1985, the Japanese government officially declined this request in ministerial meetings due to the impossibility of a quantitative estimation of the action program. So through this case study, the conclusion and the implication for future research are as follows. So firstly, the above case shows that the influence of European Commission and the member states over the EU position in international trade negotiations could depend on the stages of negotiation. So when issuing mandate, the EC was directed by the member states' preferences, especially of those with the majority in the Council. However, when negotiating with trading partners, the European Commission had the reframing ability to decide how to achieve the objective of the Council's mandate. My analysis didn't focus on the implementation and ratification, the implementation process, but later Bruno's and Carlo presentation mentions. Now I think European Parliament and also national parliament should be taken into account in this model. And however, considering the European Commission's shared preference with the Council before issuing the mandate, namely the necessity of Japanese import target, it was empirically difficult to determine the origin of the idea for import target within the EC. So, and also to prove this hypothetical model of vertical interplay between the European Commission and the EC member states, it's necessary to investigate more cases of subsequent international trade negotiations. For example, the EC Japan trade negotiations in the late 1980s and also the 1990s, and more recent one like the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, which came into effect in 2019. So in this case, I guess we need to mention the role of the European Parliament in this model. So bibliography are as follows, and as primary sources, I use Japanese and also European archival and official documents. So yeah, it's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. And also I'm happy to get some comments from you, and I'm looking forward to listen to other your presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Taro, and it's perfectly timed, not just in terms of your presentation overall, but also how you use the triggers in the PowerPoint, which I often struggle to do. But very interesting because it's based on a lot of insight, not just from the EU side of documents, but also engagement with non-European documents. I think something we can sometimes find lacking in European studies. Okay, so next up is Lewin Schmidt's presentation on the European Union's diplomatic communication in social media, and I think that's going to be and also a really interesting presentation because it's going to offer, I think, a good original data set on the tweets, which is, I think, a quite impressive data set on the EU's tweets on global affairs. Okay, so Lewin Schmitt is a predoctoral fellow in Barcelona in Spain, and then he's also a PhD candidate at the University of Pompeu Fabra. And without further ado, Lewin, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you also to the other panelists and to you, Baris, for making this happen. As you said, my paper looks at Twitter data to study EU foreign affairs. It's called EU Twitter Diplomacy, a Text Mining Analysis. And well, you're all foreign policy experts, so I don't need to convince you of the importance of studying the EU's relationships with these three cases. I chose China, India, and Russia for some methodological reasons, but also because I think all three are really high on the foreign policy agenda from a European perspective, and hence merits of our attention. So over the past years, Twitter has obviously become really important in public diplomacy, not just in the case of President Trump, we could have seen that, but also in terms of nation branding. There have been efforts to use Twitter to reach foreign audiences relatively easily. And there's also been a lot of exchange, obviously, on social media among those who in some way influence foreign policy. So I think that's one reason why this is important to study. But it's also an interesting source of data, of original data, to look at public perceptions or public opinion. So my first research question is sort of, what are public perceptions on the EU's different relationships? And here, there's of course important caveats. So the Twitter user base is not perfectly representative of the wider population. There's certain limitations in that. But I think it still reflects certain trends and sort of wider currents in the foreign policy discussions. And also it's important in its own because, as I said, a lot of influencers or journalists, politicians, they get informed on Twitter and they also shape or share their views on Twitter. So it's important to know what they are saying when they are on Twitter. Yeah, so the second part is sort of on the Twitter diplomacy. So here I zoom in on EU accounts only, so official institutional accounts from the European Union, but also from its politicians and spokespersons, to study how they talk about their diplomatic relations. I shall say, sorry if I just go back, I shall say this maybe are two papers in one. So I need to see whether I have to split it up. Basically, this came from a different research project and sort of grew extensively. So I'm really much looking forward to your comments also, because I'm definitely going to revise the structure of the paper over the summer. So let me quickly explain what I did in terms of the data collection and processing. So this is an original data set of almost 1 million tweets over the last 5 years that, well, they are limited to English-speaking tweets only, which is another consideration to keep in mind when making sense of the findings. But especially on Twitter, there's a clear trend, and especially in the foreign policy community, to issue important statements in English, which is sort of the lingua franca for foreign policy. Basically, for a tweet to match the criteria, it had to, well, for a tweet to be included in my dataset, it had to match certain criteria. It had to have a reference to both sides, so the EU and one of the three partners. So you could imagine if a tweet talks about Brussels and President Putin, then it sort of checks both sides and it would be grabbed. So I have a list of keywords that are also in the appendix if you want to have a look at that. Basically, it's sort of common sense synonyms for example, in the case of China, it would be Jinping, it would be Beijing, it would be the CCP, all these kind of synonyms. And then to this, I added tweets only from the EU accounts. As I mentioned before, I also created an original list of I think even more than 400 accounts, also of commissioners from the last 5 years, so from the previous cabinet, and to see whether they were mentioning any of these 3 partners. Then I cleaned the data. So I did some standard pre-processing from natural language processing, which means to remove stop words, for example, articles, conjunctions, everything that's basically void of qualitative information. There are established lexica for this that one can use to make this relatively easy. And then also stuff like removing punctuation, transforming to lowercase, etc. Then I went on to use sentiment analysis and assigning emotion scores to the tweets. So this is also by now a fairly established method in other disciplines, I think less so in international relations or political science, even though there was a very interesting talk also this morning in one of the panels on gender and how the European Commission talks about gender, which used a very similar method. Basically, the idea is that you look at a tweet or any text and you count words that are associated with either negative or positive values. So for example, if I talk about, if the EU says it's welcoming something, then welcoming would be associated with perhaps a score of +2. And so this is how you compute the overall score for a tweet. It's important to say that this is not really reliable to assess individual tweets or individual pieces of data, but it works really well when you have big data sets, as is the case in this current project, because the errors that may occur, they even each other out in this big data. Then lastly, I applied very simple descriptive statistics and some regression analysis. For that, I usually sort of accumulated or aggregated all the tweets for a unit of analysis of 1 month. So that I think makes sense because it's sort of, if it would be 1 year, then it would be too broad and you could not distinguish between certain events that were happening within the year. But you need to have some aggregation because, as I said, this method only works when you have many tweets. So in order to compute the sentiment of June 2018, I needed to have enough tweets. And I found that 1 month was a good unit of analysis. Right, so what does it show us? First of all, here just a bird's view on the volume of tweets. You can see in blue the tweets talking about the EU-Russia relationship. They've been the most talked about in the first 2 years, 2016, 2017, and also kept growing ever since. Here it's important to note that Twitter, like the overall amount of tweets put on Twitter, has been relatively constant since 2016. So the increase that we can see here is actually substantial. So sort of the Twitter baseline has been flat, but more and more people are talking about the EU's foreign relations, which is interesting in its own, I think. EU-India is in green. It's been much less talked about than the other 2 relationships, but it's also catching up. And at the end of last year, it's almost been at the same level as the EU-Russia relationship. Then we have in red EU-China, which has been growing a lot over the last years. And I think every observant of EU foreign policy would have expected this. And you also can see the strong spikes in the beginning of 2020, which clearly is connected to the coronavirus. And this will also have an impact on the sentiment, as we will explore in one of the next graphs. So yes, my first research question was sort of, how does the Twitter public talk about the 3 different relationships? So as I said, here in this case, I actually looked at all the tweets for one relationship, for example, the EU-Russia relationship, and computed the average sentiment of all those tweets. And then I ran some regressions between those 3 data sets to see whether there were statistically significant differences. And as you can see, Sentiment, again, in line with our expectations, is lowest for EU-Russia and highest for EU-India, which is, I think, the most or the least controversial of the three relationships. EU-China is sort of in between, but to my surprise, actually more on the positive side. And yeah, the asterisk indicates that these differences are statistically significant. We can also show this in a temporal graph. So here we can really see in the case of EU-China relations how, especially in the last year, and I think this is clearly connected to the coronavirus, the sentiment dropped. So this is also because probably a lot of the tweets were mentioning words like death, disease, pandemic, which would all have negative connotations. So this clearly leaves a mark. EU-India is much more positive, even though it has this curious bump in 2018. But probably this difference is not strong enough to read anything into it. And then EU-Russia much lower, but curiously also a slight improvement over the last years. But again, I haven't done the math on this, but I think this is not so statistically significant as the overall differences. My next research question was whether, well, how does the EU talk about its diplomatic relations on Twitter, and whether there's variation between the way it talks about the three relationships. And here what I find is, and I call this a verbal politeness effect, which again, to any observer of diplomacy should not come as a surprise, but I think it's still interesting that the data supports this. The EU diplomatic channels use more polite or more positive language than an average user on Twitter. So it's again statistically significant. I showed here the parody account of "Is the EU Concerned?", which basically hints at the fact that EU condemnations of foreign policy events always use really sugar-coated language. So the EU is really good in finding euphemisms or finding synonyms to express in very polite terms whenever something is not to their liking. This becomes even more interesting, this verbal politeness effect, when you look at the three different relationships. So I disaggregated here. Sorry, the slide is acting weird. Basically, what I find is that this verbal politeness effect mostly applies to EU-China and EU-India relations. So EU accounts talk more kindly or more positively than the normal Twitter user when they talk about China and India. But this is not the case, or at least it's much less pronounced when talking about the Russia relations. And again, I think this should not come as a surprise. We all know that the EU has been more outspoken in criticizing Russia than perhaps China, where there would also be a lot of substantive differences, but where the questions of market access have often muted any criticism that could come out of Brussels. The last part of the analysis then looks at keywords. So it's a really basic keyword frequency count. So how often does a certain keyword appear in relation to other words? And then I got rid of all non-meaningful words such as Europe or European, and only looked at substantive issues, and then had the top 5 of the last 5 years. So there's a lot of information in this graph, but basically what it shows is that we have changing prioritization over time, as one should expect. We also see that singular events can have a very strong impact. So on the left hand in the EU-China panel, you see COVID-19 clearly dominating the last year. But you also see that there's a lot of talk on EU-China relations on market access, questions of economic cooperation or trade, international property rights, etc. Whereas the case of EU-India is much less on topical issues. So beyond water and climate, so sort of the environmental concerns, everything is soft language. It's about cooperation, partnerships, summits, etc. And I think that also speaks to the kind of diplomatic engagement that the EU has with India. And this is especially strong in contrast to Russia, where we have, basically it reads like a shopping list of foreign policy issues that the EU has with Russia. We have the Crimea crisis and Ukraine being really high on the agenda. We have Syria and Iran, disinformation, the poisonings, etc. And I thought what's also interesting is that instead of summits, we have individual foreign policy officials. So Federica Mogherini and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov both get into the top 5, which I think shows the personalized way of conducting diplomacy when it comes to Russia compared to EU-India, where it's all about summits. And yeah, this is the last slide. Basically, I looked at whether certain keywords are most appear more often with negative or positive tweets. But I think my time is up, so I'm just gonna finish here, and I welcome you and invite you to read the paper if you're interested in the details. Thank you.
Thanks, Lewin. Very interesting, and I think the confusion on the side of the EU on how to, particularly Russia and China, is a bit of reflective in this in the tweets as well, because you identify the same words both in positive and negative sides, kind of reflective, I guess, of the uncertainty on the side of the European Union. And then I think we can now move forward with our last presentation, which is a co-authored piece on the role of domestic decision-making, mainly on the parliaments on EU-Mercosur trade negotiations. And this is a paper co-authored by Dr. Bruno Luciano, a postdoctoral fellow at Sao Paulo State University, and Dr. Cairo Junqueira, an assistant professor at Federal University of Sergipe. And without further ado, I think I'll leave the floor to our next presentation, and I'm looking forward to hear it. Again, I'll let you know when you have 1 minute remaining, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Baris. Can you guys see my screen? Yeah. Yeah, can you see it?
It's perfect.
Okay. Thanks for Baris for organizing this panel. So this paper, Cairo and I, we were basically working. We're trying to combine forces in a sense that I usually work on research looking at the role of parliaments in regional integration and international affairs. And Cairo usually works with subnational actors in international relations and regional integration. So we try to look at the case of EU-Mercosur trade negotiations, which is a big deal for, especially for South America, as Mercosur is the biggest bloc in the region. And we were trying to actually combine our analysis on parliamentary diplomacy, para-diplomacy, and see what's actually the role of national and subnational parliaments in these particular trade negotiations. So yeah, I'm just going to bring a brief introduction, then look at the national and subnational parliaments in trade negotiations. Quite briefly, just mention some key challenges and topics of the EU-Mercosur agreement in particular. Then moving on to what we have found so far in terms of the reactions of national and subnational parliaments when it comes to these particular negotiations. And then we have, as a last part, a more comparative analysis, trying to look at what are the differences in terms of the performance of these parliaments and in the same trade negotiations to see whether we have interesting mobilization factors that actually explain what is the role or which kind of involvement parliaments at the national and subnational levels have been playing in these negotiations. So we're obviously looking at the case of EU-Mercosur Association Agreement. I think this is a particular relevant agreement because in terms of the population, if the agreement is fully implemented, that would gather that would be the biggest association agreement in terms of population. So it's huge markets being under free trade.
Bruno,
So
Bruno,
yes.
Excuse me. I'm just seeing your first slide. I don't know if Baris and the others are seeing the full slide. I'm seeing only the first one, Bruno.
Let's see.
I don't know. I think for you are seeing the whole slide, but here we are seeing the first slide with the another ones at the left.
Yeah, I got it. Okay, let's see. So probably I shared the wrong the wrong window. Yeah. Let's see. What about now?
Let's have a look.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it the
yeah,
introduction slide?
Yeah, that's the introduction slide.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cairo. Yeah, so we're looking at the involvement of parliamentary actors. We're trying to see similarities and differences in terms of how EU and Mercosur national and subnational parliaments have been involved in these negotiations, and we pick up what we understand it's 5 key mobilization factors, which are decision-making competence of these parliaments. They differ in terms of the regions and regional blocks, and also political systems in different regions. Resistance of parliamentary and political actors in parliaments, level of transparency of those negotiations, political visibility that political actors might gain from being involved in these negotiations, and also pressure of interest groups, which also have shaped the role of parliaments in these negotiations. And for us, it's really interesting in looking at the role of the two concepts that we think it's relevant for us in terms of highlighting the role of parliaments in foreign affairs and trade agreements. So one is parliamentary diplomacy, which has been a very much emerging concept in terms of IR scholars looking at the role of parliaments in these topics. And then not just supranational parliaments such as the European Parliament, but also national parliaments and sometimes subnational parliaments when they do find opportunity to actually engage with international affairs. And on the other hand, we're trying to propose the idea of parliamentary paradiplomacy, which is highlighting how we could combine paradiplomacy, which is the role of subnational actors in international affairs, with the role of parliamentary actors from those subnational actors in foreign affairs. So that would be interesting to see whether subnational actors at the parliamentary level, they might actually play a key role in these negotiations. So much of the literature so far has been covered a lot, the process, the emerging role of the European Parliament in trade policy, in EU trade policy since the Lisbon Treaty, with the change and the role the Parliament has been playing in these negotiations, and its role not going beyond its consent to the actual trade agreements. But recent literature has also been exploring the role of national and subnational parliaments in the European context in terms of trade. So we're also interested to engage with this emerging literature and contribute in a sense that looking at one particular negotiation, and also not just looking at the case of Europe, but also look at how third partners also have sort of developed some level of parliamentary involvement. So this is why we also include the role of Mercosur parliaments in this case. And I've just mentioned the key drivers, so I'll go back to them when we do the comparative analysis. Just a few words on EU-Mercosur agreement. So just to let you know that for those not familiar with this agreement, this is a very actually old agreement, perhaps not that old when you look at trade relations with the EU with Japan, but yeah, I mean, since the 90s actually there is tried a sort of approximation between the EU and Mercosur, and the negotiations started 20 years ago. And just now, well, 2019, they reached an agreement in principle, which was only able to be concluded due to protectionism of US under Trump that made the EU start to look at old agreements and try to renew them and give some impetus for further negotiations. And from the Mercosur side, one could see the rise of right-wing governments that were much more favorable of neoliberal policies and especially trade liberalization. So this particular moment was was a kind of window of opportunity to actually the conclusions of the negotiations. The problem is the political agreement is reached, but so far the agreement is still pending a legal revision, translations from official languages from both sides, and then signature before it goes through the process of parliamentary ratification. And some key challenges have emerged since then. And the main ones are environmental issues. So a lot of public opinion in Europe mostly, but also in South America, have been highlighting the role of the problems with Amazon deforestation under Jair Bolsonaro government. Also, some human rights issues have been raised related to violence to indigenous people in Brazil. Agriculture sector in Europe, especially those sectors I highlight there in the slides, they're also very much against the agreement. And from the Mercosur side, perhaps the main reason or the main challenge would be something on industrial protectionism in some countries, particularly in Argentina, which are very much afraid of the economic impacts on this agreement for their own sector. And then here, it's basically our main empirical analysis so far. So we try to look at the reaction of national and subnational parliaments, and we see how we actually have some interesting differences and similarities. So in the EU case, first we have seen that there's a lower support of the public opinion from the agreement. So that actually shaped how some national parliaments, but also some regional parliaments, in the case of Belgium mostly, have been reacting negatively to the implementation of these agreements. So far we have seen movements from parliaments of Austria, Ireland, Netherlands, France, and also the Walloon Parliament in Belgium, issuing motions rejecting the signature of the agreement. So before even the agreement, there is actually a public document of the agreement that is going to be sent to parliamentary ratification. So national parliaments and some regional parliaments, they have been preventively reacting already, stating that they are not agreeing with the agreement in its current form, and mostly because of some of the topics that I've mentioned in previous slides. So it's interesting that also some countries that are usually very much favorable of the agreement, such as Spain and Portugal, because of the historical ties with Latin America, some MPs there, especially from opposition, but also left-wing parties, they have been rejecting the agreement, or they either have requested some further information on what's going to be the impact of the agreement for their local economies and particular agriculture sectors. And then lastly, I think trying to dialogue with this idea of parliamentary paradiplomacy, we have seen also that Flemish Parliament, also in Belgium, have so far organized some public hearings, asked for additional conditions before ratification. So they're not necessarily against the agreement, as we can see in the Walloon Parliament, but they are also very cautious about the agreement. So it's interesting how decision-making competences show some more engagement from these parliaments. So when parliaments are more involved with ratification, which is the case of these parliaments in Belgium, so they will have to ratify agreements, as we know, to actually implement these agreements from the EU side. So as they have this room for maneuver, they actually explore that and try to get more engaged with agreements that they're actually under even before the ratification process. So that was also interesting for us. On the other hand, in Mercosur countries, public opinion is rather absent. You have some movements, but not really relevant, and especially they are quite lower when you compare to the EU side. Usually, few moments that we find some MPs actually referring to the agreement, they mostly do that at the Mercosur Parliament, which is the regional parliament or the parliament from Mercosur. It's a consultative assembly, which always try to resemble the European Parliament, but with no competences in the case of Mercosur. But just at this point, we actually have found MPs actually talking about the agreement, and usually they refer to the agreement to say something on the level of transparency of the negotiations. Also, actually, we have, when you compare to the European case, Mercosur countries, they seem much more favorable regarding the agreement. Perhaps the only exception is Argentina, which is now under a left-wing government, and they are being more resistant to the agreement. But even though they have never said that they actually will not approve the agreement, so it's different how they also relate to the agreement. And lastly, especially when you compare to the EU, again, there's no role actually, or very low degree of involvement of subnational parliaments. So this is also interesting, and this also might be associated with the fact that subnational parliaments in no countries in Mercosur, they actually have a clear competence in terms of parliamentary ratification. So this is the table that we presented on the paper. We try to put together all the 5 drivers and looking at both sides. I've mentioned some of these differences and similarities. I just want to highlight some of them. I think resistance is a key driver here, because you have a high level resistance in the case of the EU from many national and some subnational parliaments due to mostly environmental issues. And we haven't really seen this in the case of Mercosur, and that might also play a particular role when we reach the ratification stage. It's also interesting to see how political visibility, for instance, it's also differences from both cases, where you actually in the EU case you have anti-liberalization, green and regional parties actually interested in reacting with, about the EU-Mercosur agreement, while in Mercosur there's a low participation of parties, of even social movements, to actually try to avoid the negotiations. And then, yeah, key interested groups playing a key role in both parts. It's agriculture. So in one case, agriculture being against the agreement, and in the other side, agriculture being very much in favor of the agreement. So this also highlights how interest groups have been putting some pressure on political elites to actually either reject or ratify the agreement in the future. So just to sum up, so we're trying to understand the role of national subnational parliaments in external trade negotiations. The EP is enhancing its participation in trade since the Lisbon Treaty especially, but also we have seen some movements from national parliaments which are strongly voicing their position on EU trade policies. And also subnational actors, and probably the most representative ones are the regional parliaments in Belgium. They have also been very much engaged with trade negotiations, and this is also have been the case in the EU-Mercosur deal. On the other hand, we haven't seen really much relevant engagement from Mercosur parliaments, and this also have to do with political and historical context of presidential systems in case of South America, where actually the presidents and national governments, they actually have they are actually very much in control of the whole process of trade negotiations, and parliaments have been very much marginalizing this process. And lastly, we think that this framework of mobilization factors, they might be useful to actually assess the role of parliaments in other trade negotiations, not just EU trade negotiations. For instance, looking at the role of parliaments in the EU negotiations with Japan, with Canada, might be also interesting. But also, we think that beyond the EU, there's also pretty much space for research on these dimensions. So thank you very much. We are looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno, and also Dr. Junqueira at Cairo for your contributions to the paper. Very interesting on the role of domestic decision-making in international trade negotiations. So I think we have time for our questions and answers. So if you have any questions, feel free to type your questions on the chat room for this panel. And I have also unlocked the panel for those who want to join through voice or video. But I think I can kickstart questions to a couple of our presenters today. So just taking advantage of my position as a chair, Magdalena, I was wondering if you had any challenges about interviewing officials on such a sensitive topic. I'm particularly interested in hearing your experiences on this, because I also interviewed some EU and NATO officials on crisis management operations. I was wondering if you had any drawbacks to that. And Taro, I have a question for you as well. How do you think? I mean, how meaningful do you think is the role played by the EU? Negotiations with Japan. Do you think that the EU's role is more symbolic, or do you think that it's actually can make a difference on the role of member states and other actors as well? Do we have any other questions? So maybe I can collect a few more questions.
Can I add one comment or something like this?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, thank you. Bruno is an old friend, and we are always trying to make this link between the EU and South American regionalism. And thank you also, Baris, for being the coordination of this panel, and Magdalena, Lewin, and Taro for sharing their researches with us. And I don't know if I have a question to Magdalena, but it's also what Baris just asked Magdalena, because here, for example, in Brazil and Mercosur, we have another bureaucracy just to do interviews and something like this. And I also want to know, how did you deal with the interviewers, and they just asked for anonymity about your research. And for Lewin, I just want to know, Lewin, it's very interesting. I don't know much about statistical method and something like this, but you just mentioned in your article about the, how can I say, the fake tweets, or like the bots, what we can call. You just mentioned about the bots, and I just want to know a little bit more about this, because you said that it was also a problem for your research. And I don't know if it's one question, Lewin, but I just want to know, because you just highlight the relation between EU, Russia, China, and India, and Brazil is out of this research. And I don't know if it's because what we are dealing right now here in Brazil with all problems that we are facing, and I just want to know if you just make this research, you just remove it, or you just not include Brazil, and why? And for Taro, my last question, Taro, I just want to know how you deal with your theoretical and conceptual framework. You just mentioned Morawiecki's work, and you just mentioned Putnam's work also, and I just want to know how you are making some link between your topic about the relations between European Union and Japan with your background, if I can say. And that's it. Thank you again, Baris, and thank you all for this opportunity.
Thanks, Cairo, for very interesting questions. So I reckon we can start with the order of our presenters. Magdalena, would you like to provide some answers to these questions?
Yes, thanks a lot. That's an interesting question that I've just now reflected and have found that actually it was not very difficult. I wouldn't say, well, I have had, of course, have to do online interviews, which is difficult in its own way, and I cannot really. I wouldn't say that the difficulties in acquiring interview partners would be connected to the sensitivity of the issue at hand. I would say, when I've been thinking now about also connecting it to the research topic and the move of counterterrorism policy from police-based work towards more societal-based security, that might be connected to that. Because if I compare, for example, within my sample of interviews, I've for example tried to contact or to interview also representatives from Europol, which I was not successful with. Whereas diplomatic representations, political, so to say, actors from the EU framework working on counterterrorism, or implementing projects with civil society, so representing the soft counterterrorism approach, has been much easier. So that would be my way of making sense of the little difficulties that I've had. I would say then the harder the security conceptualization, the more difficult it gets. That would be my feeling, but I have not thought so much about it, because I have not found that my topic is as sensitive, which is interesting also in that sense, because what I've also found very interesting, and I will write about this certainly, is that terrorism and violent extremism has not been framed as a sensitive issue. It is a security issue, of course, and I would say it's inherently sensitive, but it is apparently, at least within enlargement, a consensual issue, that there is not much conflict, or the issues that civil society raises within the EU is not so much an issue within enlargement. And that's, I think, also contributing to that.
Perfect. And okay, maybe we can now move forward with Taro. And I asked the question, and I think Taro, you also have a question from.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for your great, very insightful questions. First of all, Baris, yes, the EU, in my opinion, the EU was growing its role in international trade negotiation in 1970s and 1980s in general, but I think it really depends on the forum. So, for example, World Trade Organization in the past, GATT, in the GATT multilateral trade negotiation, I think even from 1970s, the European Commission negotiated on behalf of the EC. So they have very significant role. But looking at bilateral relations, like between the EC and Japan, usually the arrangements were not tariff reduction, not formal tariff reduction, usually like consultation and voluntary export restraints or voluntary import expansion. So this kind of informal or not legalized, how can I say, negotiation, the still member states were very important actor, especially in 1970s. But as I mentioned, 1980s, the European Commission want to engage more actively in the negotiation, even for bilateral negotiations. So I think this 1980 is a kind of turning point of this kind of, how can I say, the EC Commission or EC as a international actor in international trade negotiation. And yes, and also I think it's very important to conceptualize this kind of role of European Union, European community, not only from perspective of European side, because the reason why I wanted to focus on, I also mentioned some Japanese diplomatic documents is, I think it's very important to know how Japan perceived Europe in 1980s. So I want to say this kind of relational or two sides conceptual or cognitive understanding of EU as a actor is very important, I think. And concerning Kai's questions, yes, I think the reason why I cited Moravchik and Putnam is I didn't mention so much about in this presentation, but in my PhD project, I want to use 2-level or 3-level games of to Japan EC relations in 1980s, and usually this concept focuses on the relation between member states and also European between member states, so member states negotiation and supranational European Commission, but usually more focus I can say member states. So I think even if European Commission is important, but so I want to focus on this kind of interplay. So that's why I mentioned 2 scholars. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Taro. And I think Cairo also had a question to Lewin.
Yes, thank you. So for your first question, why I didn't include Brazil, well, there was sort of technical limitations as to how much data I can process on my little machine. And I must say that from a European point of view, Brazil would then be less high on the agenda than the other 3 cases. But I am planning to extend the analysis to more countries, so also US, UK, Japan, and then probably also Brazil. But yeah, this was sort of exploratory research, and now that I have established the method, I hope I can extend it to more cases. Mm-hmm. Your other question about bots, that's very well taken. So in the speech of Twitter, it's unauthentic accounts or something like that. So accounts that don't belong to real entities. And that's a big problem when you study real-time data and streaming of Twitter, because, well, people create accounts and they post something as they go. But if you look at historical data, I think it's less problematic because Twitter is actually quite good at retrospectively discovering and then removing those Twitter bots and botnets. So I don't know, for example, if there was a Russian influencing campaign in 2016, it would by now be removed from the data, so it would not be part of my data set. But of course, it's always there's always a problem of authenticity of Twitter accounts, and yeah, that has to be acknowledged.
Great. And I think also, Lewin, just a quick question. Are you planning to share this data set at some point, maybe when you publish an article? Or?
Yes, I would love to make it available.
Yeah, perfect. And we have a question in written on the chat room to Lewin, and I think he kind of addressed that in brief, but maybe he would like to follow up on that. Would you like me to read it out loud, Lewin? The question?
I mean, for me, it's not. I've read it, and I'm grateful for.
Okay.
Shall
so
we?
just
yeah.
Just audience as well. So he asked a question about the data collection in Lewin's project, and he asked, during the collection of tweets in EU-Chinese relations, may you consider this information in this platform as a one-sided voice, as the platform isn't available in China. Chinese scholars and Chinese public seemingly give less opinions in this platform, in contrast to scholars and public in India and Russia. So collecting information about EU-China relations seem not comprehensive or may not be comprehensive to analyze EU-Chinese relations. So that was Lee's question. So yeah, maybe you want to address that, Lewin?
Yeah, thank you. So I just also shared 2 links to outlets to talk about Chinese activity on Twitter, because I mean, Shaolin is correct; it's not available within China, but still, this doesn't mean that Chinese figures of foreign policy figures are not active on it. To the contrary, they are very active, especially over the last years. And it seems like this is actually a strategic move, which is obviously legit because other countries also do the same. So I think it's less one-sided than what one might think. But I appreciate his concern, and maybe I should have been more clear in the paper. This is not to say that a certain relationship is better or worse. I mean, I don't want to have any normative claims here. It's just that in this case, people talk more in negative terms about the relationship, but this could also be, as I said in the presentation, now with the coronavirus, people mention death or some other negative words in connection with China and EU. This doesn't necessarily mean that they have a negative view on the relationship, but I do also think it could have important ramifications if people are always connecting certain words with a certain partner. So also from a Chinese point of view, this could be interesting to further study and to see how they can improve their public image on Twitter and other social media. But yeah, I apologize if something wasn't clear. I wasn't criticizing or attacking anyone here in that sense.
Perfect. Great, Lewin. Any other questions from the audience? Feel free to type them in the chat room, or feel free to join for a few minutes. Yeah, Magdalena has a question.
I still have questions for the other panelists. So first of all, to Taro, I'm wondering what the case of Japan, because you mentioned also in the presentation that the need for further research would also be about Japan. So what does EU-Japan relations tell us more generally about trade relations, and for example, I was wondering, when you talk about member state or supranational intergovernmental relations, if we look at Brexit, which highlighted so much the Commission's competences in trade relations, I'm wondering what would change if you, for example, looked at that to your argument. And for Lewin, because you asked us whether to restructure the paper, and I was when you said that, I was wondering, yes, maybe Maybe it's 2 papers because I was wondering what the 2 different types of data actually how they talk to one another. So do you want to make a comparison between public sentiment and EU actual diplomacy, because they are aware, right, when tweeting that this is diplomacy? Or are you looking at 2 different parts of diplomacy / public diplomacy? So I think because you asked the question, I would wonder, yeah, maybe splitting might make sense. But for you, it's just a question, would a comparison, would you want to make a comparison, let's say? And for Bruno and Cairo, I was curious if, because you talked about opposition and resistance in both the EU and in South America, I'm wondering if there has been a transnational opposition movement or a transnational campaign that opposition movements have joined communication.
Great. And maybe I can add a very, very quick question to Bruno and Cairo. Do you think, Bruno and Cairo, do you think there's a concern about the speed and transparency of decision making when it comes to national parliament? Because you said in South America there might be some structural factors, such as the strong role of the presidents over the legislature. Do you think that when the parliaments are more kind of less strong and president being more stronger, do you think that gives them the ability to and compared to their EU counterparts? And thank you very much. Any other questions from audience? I can't see any question at the moment, so maybe we can start with Taro. And would you like to address Magdalena's question, Taro?
Thank you, Magdalena. Thank you for your question. I think, yeah, you're right. So now the European, like for example, when we see the Japan EU, EU-Japan EPA, the negotiation is always made by the European Commission, and internally negotiating with among member states. But I think it's also because of the legalization of the trade relationship, because now more FTA and EPA is spreading, and also multilateral trade negotiation. This kind of negotiation, specifically this tariff should be reducted, or this kind of non-tariff barrier should be like removed. So in this case, I think European Commission has clear competence on this kind of things. But when I see 1980s, the European Commission, European Community competence at the time, European Commission's competence was not so clear, and the trade negotiation was also like more informal way. So that's why I think this is the one reason the European EC member states has some kind of the, how can I say, power to influence over the trade policy in EC. And also this in line with the creation of single European market. So in 1980s and early 1990s, after the single market became, almost all trade barrier in the Europe was removed. So in this case, it was much more easier to, it became much more easier to, how can I say, to negotiate for the European Commission to negotiate with other trading partners, because already there is a single market in the Europe. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks for addressing the question, Taro. And next question is, I think, to Lewin, again from Magdalena.
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. I would actually prefer to also give some comments on your papers and then answer the questions maybe later if by email. So Cairo and Bruno, I really thought your paper was excellent. And maybe my main concern would be about the table that you have, and also the listing of mobilization drivers, because I actually think 4 of them make a lot of sense. But resistance to me, that seems to be the dependent variable that you're actually explaining with the other independent variables. So I would just invite you to think about that, whether you maybe want to sort of reshuffle it a bit, because I think, at least from my reading of the paper, you're interested in whether a parliament is sort of resisting or engaging with the trade agreements. So yeah, there just seemed to be something you could work on. And then the rest I will send by email also to Magdalena and Taro. Thank you.
Perfect. And I think we also had questions to Bruno and Cairo from Magdalena, and one quick question from myself.
Bruno, do you want to start, or is okay?
If you want,
okay, yes. I think we have 3 questions, and I'll try to make one or two things right here, and then you can finish it, Bruno, please.
Okay.
About the opposition, I think that I don't know, Magdalena, if we can talk about a transnational opposition regarding the agreement. I think that the agreement it's complicated because it was signed in 2019, but it's not even translated or even ratified, and we can see a lot of specific sectors that have opposition about the agreement. So sometimes we have these specificities, and I think we cannot talk about one transnational opposition. For example, concerning this presentation, Bruno and we just wrote a post blog for UASIS, and there we talked about the challenge for the ratification of the agreement. And one of the main topics is about the Amazon deforestation. And so I'm just taking one example about a specific point, and what we are facing right now. And there are a lot of presidents I think Macron, if I'm not wrong, said that with Bolsonaro's, for example, here in Brazil, the deal will not be ratified or something like this. And of course, deforestation is one topic. The green parties of the European Parliament is another one, and it's another section that it's just been so strongly opposite of the agreement. And so I think these are the main points we are facing right now. I don't know if I can use these words, but we are facing one critical conjuncture about the agreement. So it was signed, but it was not only ratified, because it's not only a commercial agreement. We have a lot of things that must be included. Of course, it's not one specific thing of the agreement between EU and Mercosur, and it can be. We can take it to account into others agreement, but the oppositions are just to ratify it's just so opposite. I don't know if there was one transnational opposition. And just to finish, then Bruno, you can add what you want. Baris, when you just asked about there are some analysis of Mercosur and about South American countries, that here we have hyper presidentialism. So comparing Mercosur with the European Union, in the European Union we have a more active of the parliament, if I can say that. About the parliament concerning the EP, the European Parliament, and the national parliaments, I think one of our main conclusions of the article is that when you analyze the European Union, the national and subnational parliaments have a more, how can I say this, has a huge impact when you can talk about the agreement. Because here, yes, I can say that I agree with you, Barry. Here in South America and in Brazil, we have the executive branch has a lot of power when we can compare with the judiciary and the legislative. So the agreement is just one point, but it can we can say that the agreement just showing this process here of our countries, including Brazil, and I think we can also say about Argentina, Paraguay, and in Uruguay also. And just to finish, and then Bruno can just say what he wants. Thank you, Lewin, for your opinion. We just sent this article for a journal, and we are just waiting for some answer. And sometimes this question about dependent and independent variables will be mentioned, and it will we will focus on this to just make some points. Thank you again, Bruno. Please.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think you covered most of the questions. Just perhaps, yeah, just from Magdalena asked about transnational movements. In the case of the EU, that was I was kind of responsible for cover that empirical part. There's a lot of transnational movements from parties and social movements, but they actually go for the EP. And we focus on national and subnational parliaments at the European Union. So that's interesting. Yeah. So how, because the EP has been playing a key role in trade negotiations, so these European transnational movements, they go straight to the European Parliament and try to voice their opinion on the agreement there, and not really on the national cases. I think I agree with Cairo. I think we should think on the variable here. I thought our variable was about parliamentary engagement in trade negotiations, not really resistance really. So then, and then the interesting was when parliaments resist, they are more engaged than when they are okay with the agreement. But then perhaps the resistance is not the best word. Perhaps it should be something about political position or position regarding the agreement. So when they are in favor of the agreement, they just stay quiet because they know that the governments are going to pass on with the ratification process. When they don't agree with the agreement, then they have to move and try to veto the agreement. So that was, let me know if that makes sense, because that was what we were thinking before, yeah. But perhaps resistance, yeah, because then you have the other way around, right? So it's what happens when they are in favor of the agreement. And so, yeah, we're trying to explore that. And then Mercosur is interesting because of that, because actually parliaments, they are in favor of the agreements, because the biggest sector in Mercosur countries are agriculture sectors, and they are big exporters, and they want to open their markets in the EU. So they are very much interested in the agreements. And they are much more influential in Mercosur countries than environmental groups. So this is why resistance has not been that relevant in Mercosur countries, even though you have all the issues with the Amazon and Bolsonaro and everything that Caro mentioned. So it's interesting how even though you have sectors in society actually in South America also against the agreement, they are not as influential as they are in the European Union right now. So that might explain why parliaments are so quiet in terms of the agreements. So thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Bruno and Cairo, for the final answers. I think we're running a bit out of time. So if any other questions from the audience or from our speakers, I would just like to remind that you can use the networking tab as a feature in the Balloon website. You can see on the left-hand side panel, and you can use that function to meet other academics and other people in the conference today and tomorrow. And you can also have small group chats or one-on-one calls with other attendants by using that networking function. So, for example, you can use lunch breaks, gaps between panels, and the time after this panel today as an opportunity to make some networking activities on that. You can also locate a particular attendee by using the people button on the right-hand side of the screen, and then contact people directly. But I really enjoyed the presentations, and I think there will be fascinating contributions to the knowledge from each presentation, and particularly on the non-European and non-EU perspectives, which is, I think, can be a bit lacking in the discipline oftentimes. But thank you very much for all of our presenters for sticking to the time and making life easier for me as a chair. And really, really great to get to know you and your research. And also thanks to our audience to listen to and ask and for their questions, and also Emily, our moderator, who kind of provided us the technical advice and assistance today. Okay, so good to see you all, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference, and hope to see you at another juncture. Thank you very much.